Hi, my name is Cody Pomeranz. Welcome to YDN Multimedia. I'm here with John Bryan Starr, Dr. John Bryan Starr, who has extensive experience in education. You are currently a consultant to school districts in Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey, and you teach 2 seminars at Yale on public school education. Thank you for being here.
I'm happy to.
So this interview, I think we want to talk about both local and national education policy and what the current state of the American public school system is. So I guess my first question is very broad. What's your assessment of where we are right now?
Better than most people think. I think that the rumor, characterization of the American school system is that public schools are failing, and I think that that's a broad generalization which applies to some schools and it does not apply to most schools.
Now, that's probably a more positive assessment than most people would say. In 1983, Ronald Reagan's National Commission on Excellence in Education released a report called A Nation at Risk. And this past year, the Council on Foreign Relations released a report saying that education was the #1 national security concern for the United States. Yet there seems to be some legislative lag, and the public, doesn't seem to urge more education reforms. Is that a problem that you see, or is that another generalization?
Well, in the first place, I think the Council on Foreign Relations Commission and its assessment of the national security risk caused by the quality of public schooling was not a particularly reliable report that I would put much credence in. The Nation at Risk report many years ago certainly triggered a great deal of concern in the United States. It was triggered primarily by a threat from the Japanese economy and the Japanese schooling system, and the notion was that we were falling behind because Japan was succeeding economically when we were not. I think today's assessment of American education has to do with comparisons to other nations on international tests, other nations which are dealing with very different student populations, very different societies, very different economies, but the comparisons are made to the United States across the board. If you disaggregate the results of American test results on those international tests, you find that many students do as well or better than the high-performing European and Asian nations. But the problem is that we're attempting to pull everyone along, and it's the everyone along which is our real problem in terms of the quality of public schooling.
So you bring up international systems and comparisons to countries like Finland and South Korea. Clearly there's some misconceptions in student performances based on more affluent districts in the United States do better. But in terms of teachers, it seems very clear that, for instance, in South Korea, I think it's the top third of every, teachers come from the top third of graduating classes, something that's really not the case in the United States. And the teaching profession is seen on the level of medicine and law. What's it going to take for the teaching profession to get, the credibility it deserves here, and for Yale students to say, I want to go take my Yale degree and become a public school teacher?
A lot more money. I think that the starting salaries and indeed the salaries across the board in public school for public school teachers are well below the salaries that could be expected if you decide to engage in a career in law, architecture, medicine, etc. And until those starting salaries and indeed the salary scale across the board is somewhat comparable, it's very unlikely that you or your fellow students at Yale would be tempted to engage in a career in public school teaching unless you were extraordinarily devoted and prepared to do without a lot of things that you would probably like to have.
Well, so teacher salaries, evaluations, these are all things that President Obama has tried to reform in his Race to the Top program. George Bush tried to do some things in his No Child Left Behind program, which has kind of been slammed since and replaced by Race to the Top. Both of these programs seem to move us towards more evaluation-based schooling for teachers, merit pay, is this a positive that we're moving towards more testing, or?
But you started talking about what's going to attract new and highly qualified people into the profession, and evaluating the people already in the profession is not really an answer to that problem. I think there are people in the profession who probably shouldn't be there, and the emphasis on teacher evaluation is designed to try to weed out those people who shouldn't be in classrooms, and then presumably one needs to move on to reward the people who stay in the classrooms. The problem with that is that we haven't figured out how to evaluate teachers effectively. The current vogue is to look at student test scores and to evaluate teachers on the basis of changes, positive or negative, in student test scores. That's nowhere near as simple as it sounds. It's a whole different way of evaluating teachers who formerly were evaluated on the basis of inputs. Did you teach this? Now the evaluation is based on, did your students learn this? It's not easy to measure. And
That's value added, right?
That's value added. I'm not a great fan of standardized tests. I think it's the cheapest alternative we have for trying to measure student performance, but it's not a very reliable measure. And the problem is that at the moment, students are only evaluated in reading, writing, math, and science at one level in the elementary schools and at high school. All of the other teachers have no tests on the basis of which to be evaluated. It completely leaves out the business of teacher observation by qualified supervisors, and that would include both principals and hopefully other lead teachers who would be in the classroom looking at teacher performance and offering their critique of that performance.
Now, some states have made evaluation at least 50% of, or made testing at least 50% of a
Correct.
teacher's evaluation. Is that too much? And if testing is a cheap alternative, are there any better indicators?
I think that I would not be in a position to say what precise percent should be devoted to using tests to evaluate teachers, using test results to evaluate teachers. I would say that we need to go slow on that until we have perfected both the tests, the number of tests that are available to offer to students, and also the way that that figures into teacher evaluations. The other way of evaluating teachers, there are several other ways of evaluating teachers, one of which, as I said a minute ago, is classroom observations. That's probably the most important, and if I were the one to create an evaluation system, I would probably give it at least as much weight as student test results. The other way is to ask students, to poll students with respect to their opinions of how teachers are doing. And yet another way is to ask parents. Parents are very much aware of what's going on in their kids' classroom, and although they may not be the best observers, that's certainly another piece of information that could be added to the evaluation process.
Now, Stephen Brill, a professor here at Yale, wrote an article in 2010 in the New Yorker about rubber rooms.
Right.
And how certain teachers, they can't really be fired, or it takes a long time to fire them. So they go and they sit in these rooms and they play cards and they sleep and they make full salary and full benefits. Now, this is part of a tide of anti-union sentiment in the United States. Should teachers retain the same protections they have from the union, and what are the future protections from the union that you see happening?
I think that teacher protections from the union are certainly under scrutiny and under attack, as you just finished saying. And I think that ultimately teacher unions are going to have to step back a little bit from the protections that they have enjoyed. Certainly even the president of the AFT, Randi Weingarten, has agreed that a rapid but fair evaluation process from non-performance to end of tenure is appropriate for teachers. And she certainly was no fan of the rubber room. It was obviously a very serious blight on the escutcheon of the teachers union once Brill brought to the attention of the public what was going on in the New York public schools. I think that several planks of the union's platform with respect to teachers need to be modified. One of them is the notion of involving seniority exclusively in placement of teachers in districts, which prevents principals and central office administrators from placing teachers where they are needed. It disadvantages the very young teachers that you were talking about earlier that you want to attract into the teaching force and keep them there, because if there are layoffs, they are the first to go out the door. So seniority, tenure, and merit pay are three of the planks of most of the union's platform that I think will be subject to negotiation and modification in future contracts, as they have to some extent here in New Haven.
Now you brought up Randi Weingarten. Randi Weingarten and Stephen Brill seem to represent two competing movements. You have the reform
Except,
movement.
as you will note, that Stephen Brill proposed Randi Weingarten as the new chancellor of the New York Public Schools, and more recently in the New York Times this week, she's been proposed as the new Secretary of Education.
Well,
she's a popular lady.
She's a popular lady, and some of that might be tongue-in-cheek, but Randi Weingarten and Stephen Brill seem to represent two competing movements. One, Stephen Brill, the reform movement, and Randi Weingarten, some would say the establishment movement, along with people like Diane Ravitch. These movements seem to claim, Diane Ravitch claims that poverty is the issue. That we're trying to pull everybody up and it's bringing everybody down, and we need more resources. Stephen Brill, points the finger at unions. Are they talking past each other? Are they both right?
They're both right, and they're both talking past one another. Yes, I would agree with that. I think that poverty and the effects of poverty on the kids who come in through the schoolroom door are vital issues that need to be addressed, and it's not possible to address those exclusively through the school system. It's a much bigger problem, a much bigger social problem, particularly in urban schooling systems, in urban cities, in urban areas. It's a much bigger problem than the schools are able to deal with on their own. But the notion is, at least on the part of Weingarten and Ravitch, is that it's an effort to blame teachers, and that teachers shouldn't be held responsible for all of the outcomes of their students because of the shortcomings that some students inevitably, not because of their own fault, bring into the schooling process.